Okay, thanks, Jay. I guess I need to use this. Okay, I'm Bruce Erzman. I'm with the Wildlife Diversity Program with Iowa Department of Natural Resources. And I've been with the agency since 1977, so I'm one of the few people still around that started in that era. I've worked with the Wildlife Diversity Program since its inception, since 1980, so I have quite a bit of background with lots of different animals. In fact, I'm giving a talk later today about amphibians and reptiles. If you've signed up for that, I'll see you there. I have some handouts here. These are actually produced by Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation. I think this is the best publication that will fit what we're talking about today, the bird's eye view. And there's an insert in it. If you have the larger booklet and don't need it, could you please put some back? Because I brought like 170 copies of stuff, and I think we pretty much used most of it up. But the insert actually occurs within this booklet. This booklet has the insert in it. So if you just, yeah, whichever. I don't think you need both, actually, is what I'm saying. If you have the big booklet, you don't need the little handout. But I just, the reason I'm mentioning this is because Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation produced this about 10 years ago, and they're running out of it. So it's nice to keep it moving to other people. Another thing I brought along, this handout is available up here and over there as well. It has a list of forest interior birds, and this came out of a publication that a group of us put together a number of years ago about forest management for interior birds, and it's a little bit more technical, so I think this handout that I brought today will be a lot better. So let's talk about how to manage for forest birds. I'm probably going to primarily talk about some of the rarer species, but we'll give it a go. So here are the questions we're going to try to talk about today. Why are forest birds declining? What are the different management techniques that we can use to benefit most forest birds? What can we do to help these forest birds in areas where you live, even backyard birds? And what are the benefits of managing for our birds? Why should we even care? Major threats to forests, of course, most of you know habitat loss, and actually forest habitat is the least diminished of all the habitats we have in Iowa. And I think that's probably true in these other states as well. Habitat fragmentation, so we'll talk about all these things in a little bit more detail as we go, especially the fragmentation aspect. And then the reduction in habitat quality. So as we have these large patches of forest become smaller and smaller, and then the habitat quality diminishes, we get fewer and fewer species of birds in them. So the 4 basic requirements, and this is true for whatever animal you want to talk about, are food. Everything needs food, different kinds, different birds like different things. Some are berry eaters, some are insect eaters, some eat berries and insects, some are predators. Cover, where animals live, whether that be forest or grassland or what have you. And water, of course, water is a very essential component. And then space. Different species have different amounts of space they need. So a wood thrush will need 61 acres to nest successfully. A cerulean warbler might need 400 or 500 acres or even larger of forest. So the forest succession, it's really important as you manage to keep all the different layers of the forest intact if you can, all the way from the forb layer, the sedge layer, to shrub layer, young forest, all the way up to climax forest. And by climax forest, I like to think of things that are 200 to 300 years old if you can, and we don't have much of that left. So in the Iowa DNR, since I've worked with this agency for a long time, we started out doing a lot of single species management, and we've had to change our focus because we don't have very many people. We have lots of responsibilities, so now we're trying to manage for guilds of species or for a whole bunch of different species at once. So we still have areas in the state where we manage primarily for particular species, whether they be game species or non-game species, but we try to manage our wildlife areas for many species as we can, and manage for species that will actually exist there. I know in the past, for instance, we were told there's one particular area, this is, okay, I can't go into stories, I better not do this. But I'm going to just use this one example, and then I'll try to stay on task. But this was 20 years ago, where one of our managers was told he had to produce pheasants. And he was in a forested area, in a wetland area, and he kind of rebelled, and so he did a presentation at our statewide meeting with Jimi Hendrix playing Purple Haze in the background in defiance of the Wildlife Bureau chief, and he really got bawled out afterwards. But he changed our policy. He helped change the policy, but he took a beating over it. So that's the kind of stuff that I witnessed in my career. Don't try to produce animals that really can't exist in certain habitats. So I've been involved with reintroducing turkeys, peregrine falcons, trumpeter swans, almost every species that's been reintroduced in the last, since 1977 I've been involved with. So that's been fun. I don't know if most of you know, but about a third of our 200 nesting birds are declining. They're listed as greatest conservation need. And then most of the birds that are declining are the ones that migrate south, the neotropical migrant species. So fully 2/3 of all of our greatest conservation need birds, and by greatest conservation need, these are species that are listed in our wildlife action plan. At least 2/3 of those are declining pretty significantly. So it's not just problems on the nesting ground, it's problems on the wintering ground. A lot of habitat is being altered or removed completely. Same kind of things that happened here in the 1800s are happening in South America, Central America, and Mexico right now. So forest birds are actually doing better than our grassland birds. We have about half of our nesting species in the state are related to forests. So we have 29 greatest conservation need forest species. This is some of them. And then these are some of our most declining species. So we've got the cerulean warbler, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a second. Black-billed cuckoo is a species, it's a shrub nesting species in forest edge, forest or grassland edge. And it's declining more than about any other species, at least in Iowa, that's true. Bobolink, we have about maybe a third as many bobolinks left now than we had in 1966. Cerulean warblers, we have about 25% as many cerulean warblers. This is on the planet, this isn't just Iowa. 25% as many cerulean warblers now as we had in 1966. So yeah, after this, all of you just hearing this talk about walnut canker, this is kind of a follow-up to it. But no, we've got good news for birds. Birds are a lot more resilient, I think, than trees. So we'll see how this works out. So one thing that's very important is to develop a woodland management plan for your property. And first thing you need to do, I think, is to see what's there, inventory. That's always a good step. Find out what you have, what kind of species that are already existing, and manage for what's there now or what species you think you can support. It's always good to look at a bigger picture. If you can look at an aerial photo of your land and how it fits in with the landscape around it. Look at the context. If your patch, depends on patch size and those sort of things on what kind of species you can keep on your property. What I just do. That's not good. Okay. So some other things to consider will be looking at the effects of climate change. As we just talked about some of the different diseases of trees that are happening right now, especially with the oak tatters. Since we're especially trying to manage for oak, we're particularly concerned about some of the diseases that are affecting oak. Increase of invasive species, emerald ash borer, Asian longhorn beetle, gypsy moth, lots of different things coming in all the time. And some of the management techniques promote a healthy, vigorous forest, try to promote overall forest diversity, and that's both plant and animals. Manage for larger forest size whenever you can. So as I mentioned, you look at the context of your patch of forest in relationship to your neighbors and in relationship to the larger landscape around you, and that can determine a lot on what species you can manage in your area. And regenerating oak is, most of the species that exist in this part of the country have adapted to oak. And oak actually is some of the most productive tree species as far as insects, as far as number of species that can exist around them than other tree species. So it's good to manage for oak when we can. And develop and maintain identified areas for species with particular habitat needs. So whether you want to develop a plan for early successional growth that can benefit certain species, later successional growth for other species. And protect fragile and unique areas. Now we'll go into a little more detail on these. So let's briefly talk about the different management systems and what species those might benefit. So early successional, even age, uneven age, and viewshed. So early successional, of course, as most of you know, can look a lot different depending on what you're doing. So we've got tree planting is an early successional stage. Direct seedling can create an early successional stage. Clear cuts, of course, are one of the easiest and fastest to create early successional stages. The kind of species that benefit. How many of you have seen woodcocks decline during your lives? A few. Yeah, that one's not around as much as it used to be. They like a particular stage of habitat. We don't know that that's the only thing that's affecting them, but we know that's one thing that's affecting them. Same thing with ruffed grouse. At least in Iowa, that's almost an endangered species. It's really becoming, the numbers are way down. Blue-winged warbler, up here in Wisconsin, it would be a golden-winged warbler. And of course, both of our cuckoos, chestnut-sided warbler, and this little guy in the middle is a white-eyed vireo. That's one you don't see very often. These all like early successional habitat. And then if you get into the even age management, even age doesn't support as many species. Well, it depends. It depends how you do it. If you do even age and do clear cuts and small patch sizes, it more simulates uneven age management. And so in general, even age doesn't support as many species because you have more uniformity. You don't have all the different layers. So this is an example, this is a photo from Yellow River State Forest in Iowa. It was a pretty good example of uneven age management. Although they also are doing even age management with small clear cuts. But over time, if you have older stands, you see a lot more diversity and you'll have a lot more species, whether that be birds, whether that be mammals, whether that be amphibians and reptiles. You just have more diversity. You have more age classes. So here's what happens with a hands-off approach, and it can happen with uneven age management in the long run, because the ultimate, of course, is, or the climax forest species, is at least here, will be maple basswood. And I'm pretty darn sure this doesn't support as much diversity as an oak ecosystem, but there's still quite a few species that could be here. Timber stand improvement leaves holes in the canopy. This benefits things like hooded warblers. So in the past, a blowdown would be the place where you'd find a hooded warbler, and you can simulate that with your forest management practices. And then view shed. This is that's kind of the hands-off approach. We use this in our state forest, especially along rivers and streams, steep slopes. And these also can lead to older trees along the rivers, and that's a good place to find our bald eagle nests and our rookeries, heron rookeries for great blue herons and great egrets. So I'm going over several of these things a number of times, but keys to improving forest habitat is avoiding forest fragmentation, managing for forest quality. So you want to minimize the number of cattle in your woods, control deer browsers. We've got some more slides to show what these mean, and manage for large nonlinear blocks of habitat. And then also manage to improve the riparian forest buffer, especially have a nice buffer along your streams. So if you have a well-managed forest, you're going to have, typically you'll have high wildlife diversity. And of course, any forest that has woodland streams or pools are going to have more diversity than the drier sites. And if you manage quite well, you also manage your erosion control, you'll have good water quality, and of course you'll have scenic beauty. So this particular photo on the left is a closed canopy, and basically you just look at the forest floor. You can see a lot more light here. It's a lot darker over here. So whichever one of those succession stages you manage for or how you manage is going to determine what lives there. So this is the more open canopy, lots of light on the forest floor, lots of sedges, lots of forbs. Oops. So this is an excellent habitat for wild turkeys, for instance, and also for whippoorwills and also for ovenbirds. So you can manage for all of these species with one type of management style and more. And then, of course, maintaining habitat quality is especially important in invasive species. It seems like every year there's a new invasive species that comes around. But we're working on that, and I think we're making a little headway in some places. Another big one in southern Iowa that's not on this list is autumn olive. And as we're getting a warmer climate, the autumn olive is moving north. And how many of you that live further north have autumn olive? How many of you heard of autumn olive? Okay. Yeah, that one's turned. Now, Russian olive's a little drier climate. I haven't seen it be invasive in Iowa, but autumn olive just absolutely, in southern Iowa, will absolutely take over a woodland that's an open woodland anyway. Really nasty stuff. And we planted it, not DNR used to plant it. Yeah. So here's what you'll have on the right, the species you'll have on the right if you get rid of the species on the left, potentially. So you always want to encourage native plants. That's something our agency, I think all agencies have finally learned. Let's not keep planting all this stuff from Asian countries that are at the same latitude because they become invasive. So native plants are best. Manage for native flowering plants and sedges. I'm mentioning sedges a couple times because that's a component that's almost gone from our wetlands, from our grasslands, and from our forests too in many places. It's a really important component. And think long-term in how you manage. So here's some native wildlife food plants. Things like hawthorn, that's another species that's really disappearing, at least in Iowa. Hawthorn is not nearly as prevalent as it was when I was a kid. And of course, oak, mass-producing trees are the best. And even things like elderberry are good, wild grape, blackberry, raspberries. And don't forget the dogwoods. There are quite a few really good dogwoods that are excellent, especially for birds. And try to limit cattle access to the forest for reasons that I don't have to go into. And here's what it looks like when you have too many deer. This is a browse line, 6 feet tall, and it's basically every state park in the state that's a forest looks like this. And because of that, we don't have wood thrushes and ovenbirds and some of those lower nesting species that require shrubbery or even ground cover. And you also don't get regeneration. So Ledges State Park, I'm located right by Ledges State Park in the center part of Iowa, and we have pretty much no regeneration of oak in that park because there's so darn many deer. So I'm a strong proponent of eating venison. So forest habitat fragmentation, taking a large area and breaking it up into smaller pieces, which is what we've done over time. Iowa had 6.7 million acres of forest at one time. We got down to about 2 million, I think, at one time, and now we're building back a little bit. Number of interior core areas is vital. So square or round parcels are best, and these are all three the same size, same number of acres, but you're going to produce a lot less birds in this narrow area than you will either one of these that are more square. So another example of fragmentation, even something like just clearing so you can see the river below creates raccoons and all kinds of predators, and cowbirds are going to be able to eliminate bird nests 100 yards either direction from that cut. How many of you know that cats are the highest human-related mortality for birds? Really good research. Stan Temple in Wisconsin did the research a number of years ago. I had a grad student that did the research originally. Well, somebody else did some more research, and it's even like 2 to 3 times the number that Stan thought. So at least, looks like at least 3 billion birds a year. And I can't even imagine what 3 billion dead birds would look like, but that's a lot of birds. But a lot of it isn't just feral cats, it's house cats. I live in town, and we have neighbors that have cats, so my wife, especially my wife, I'm not very confrontational, but she doesn't worry about that. So she goes over and talks to our neighbors, and of course we do have handouts that we give them as well. But so we're making a little headway. We have one neighbor that doesn't talk. Well, that's not true. We're all good neighbors. It works. So okay, back to the habitat patch size. So the reason that these, 160 acres in a big patch rather than 160 acres in 4 little patches is you have twice as much edge, so you have more access by raccoons and also by cowbirds. This particular species, this is actually should have been called the bison bird, because this bird doesn't build its own nest. It lays its eggs in other nests along the way. So bison, of course, were moving back and forth quite a bit when this bird adapted to its strategy of, oh, I don't need to build a nest. I'll just lay eggs in everybody else's nest. But if you don't have a nice soft edge, you have a hard edge going from pasture or cornfield or bean field directly to forest. That's where you have your highest cowbird parasitism. This bird, this female, can lay 40 to 80 eggs a year in other birds' nests. And when these eggs hatch, they'll hatch sooner than most other birds. So basically the chickadee will be raising little cowbirds that are going to turn out twice as big as it. But cowbirds are pretty good parasites. Okay, so feathered edge or soft edge is, I can't say enough about that. That's extremely important that you put a soft edge on the edge of your woods if you can. So go from disc to annuals to shrubs to trees. And here's a better photo of that. This is down in Stevens Forest. So this is going from grassland to lots of shrubs and trees, new growth. And cowbirds can't see through that. They find the bird's nest by viewing where the birds fly to their nest. And if they can't see the birds fly to their nest, then they can't parasitize their nest. Same thing with raccoons. They're going to have a heck of a time finding anything when it's this dense. So having a soft edge at the edge of your forest will help predation at least 100 yards into the forest. So different species use different layers. As I mentioned, things like ovenbirds are going to be nesting down here. Wood thrushes will be nesting here. Some of the vireos and flycatchers may be in here. And then things like cerulean warbler will probably be nesting about 60 feet up in the canopy. So it's important, if you can, to have different layers. And monocultures, just like corn, monoculture isn't good for birds. Trees or conifers plantations aren't exceptionally good for birds either. It's a great place for a Cooper's hawk to come swooping through and catch another bird flying through because it can't get away. But this is a long-eared owl. This is actually a threatened species in the state, and it does like pine plantations. It nests in crow nests. So it's one of the few species that really benefits from kind of the monoculture. But my favorite planting down in Shimmick Forest in southeast Iowa has a nice combination of pines and oaks. And actually, of course, the pines are used to get the oaks going, which works great. And then you have even more bird diversity. You have things like pine warblers that are nesting there. It's the only place in the state. So there are other ways to do it. But of course, for production, I think this is probably the best. And leave snags, at least 4 to 7 snags. I'd recommend even up to 10 snags. Standing dead trees are really important for a huge number of species, all the way from chipmunks, flying squirrels. We have 7 nesting woodpeckers. They're the primary cavity nesters. I just realized I didn't copy the right slide program because it should say 7 woodpeckers and 33 secondary cavity nesters there. That's what happens when you copy things at the last second. So how many of you knew that we had about 40 cavity nesting birds? This is in Iowa, out of about 200. So almost 1 out of 5 is a cavity nester. So the woodpeckers are the primary nesters, make the big holes that other birds rely on. So wood ducks are going to be in pileated woodpecker holes. Buffleheads will be in northern flicker holes. So it's extremely important to support those cavity nesters and secondary cavity nesters. And down logs, keeping coarse woody debris on the ground floor is really important for snakes and small mammals and such, central newts. And of course you want those drumming logs for the ruffed grouse. So this is a good example of a nice riparian bottomland that has great diversity for amphibians, reptiles, and birds. So something like a prothonotary warbler will be nesting in a little hole in a cavity over water like that. Riparian forest should provide high plant and food diversity, so lots of variety of different berries and mast and so forth. And they provide travel corridors, which are very important, maybe more important for amphibians and reptiles, but also important for birds. Lots of dead trees, like I said, at least 4 to 7 standing dead trees, at least a couple of them that are 18, 20 inches in diameter is ideal. These are some of the species you could find in the riparian forest. The wood turtle, you might, yeah, actually, I'm in the right state. Wood turtles do occur here. Red-shouldered hawk is a species that was almost gone from Iowa. We were down to 7 nests that we knew of in 1980. We now have probably 40 nests at least and growing. Bald eagles, we had no nest from 1907 to 1977. We now have at least 300 nesting pairs. Our recovery goal was 10. So some species are doing well, others not so much. Here's a good photo that kind of shows the connectivity and the importance of patch size, and having all of these different patches connected will increase the number of birds that you can support as well. And then a reforestation strategy is, so these are areas that have been cropped in the past. If you can put those back to forest, put that bottomland area back into forest, make this one big chunk of, say, 250 acres of forest, that's going to support a lot of different animals. So as I mentioned earlier, a wood thrush needs about 61 acres, ideally, to raise its family. And a minimum of 250 acres is more ideal for the more area-sensitive species. And species like cerulean warbler prefers at least 1,000 acres. So while we were working on this booklet for the blanking, the Paleozoic plateau, it's not that. Anyway, this area of the state. While we were working on the booklet for that about birds and forest management practices, at that time, we didn't think cerulean warblers were doing very well in Iowa. We have a fellow that's been studying cerulean warblers in Iowa. He found 191 territories of cerulean warblers just across the river, well, actually upriver just a little bit. So this is up in Effigy Mounds, Yellow River Forest area in Alameda County. 191 territories in 1 year. And this is what it looks like from above. And there's lots of different age classes of forest in here. It's not just all mature or over mature. So these are some area sensitive species. Worm-eating warbler is pretty rare. Kentucky warbler is declining at the rate of about 2% a year. This black and white warbler, a more northern species, occurs in this area. As I mentioned, wood thrush, that's a species that was very common when I was growing up. It's not nearly as common now. And very way common in northern Wisconsin, northern Minnesota, not so much here. And Acadian flycatcher, we're not sure why, but this one's doing quite well. It was a species that wasn't doing well 20 years ago, but it's doing well now. And then oak savanna. Don't forget the savanna. In fact, that's where we are right now. When I look out at this landscape, looked out my hotel or motel window this morning, I could see lots of savanna out in the landscape, lots of patches of oak woodland. These are pretty characteristic of species for savanna. So barn owl, which is more of a southerly species, but that's its favorite habitat. Cope's gray tree frog, Swainson's hawk, and of course red-headed woodpecker. This guy's still declining at the rate of 3% a year since 1966. And spotted skunk. How many of you have seen a spotted skunk in the last 20 years? How many of you have seen a spotted skunk ever? Oh, you have. In Iowa, our last report was about 10 years ago. So that one's very close related to savanna and just kind of blinked out while nobody was paying attention. And of course, robin is the most prolific of our thrushes. It lives everywhere. It's a generalist. It eats lots of different things. And I noticed just this weekend, it was cleaning our high bush cranberry, which is the last thing in our yard that anything will eat. And I'm not sure why people promote high bush cranberry, and I don't know that I will ever again, except it's a great emergency food. So cedar waxwings and robins just really are cleaning up on that now after the crab apples are gone. They love it. I don't know if they love it, but they're eating it. So one of the major benefits of watching wildlife or enjoying birds is it's a huge industry. How many of you knew that, for instance, it's a $318 million industry in Iowa, watching wildlife? Not much of that trickles down to the agencies and to people that work in conservation, but it's still very important to our states. And it's a $55 billion industry each year throughout the United States, watching wildlife. A lot of that's bird seed and backyard bird watching and stuff, but it's a huge industry and growing. So birds are good because they eat bugs too, right? I read a paper, and I wish I'd kept it. I'd lost it. I saw it about a week ago, but it was referring to the number of emerald ash borer beetles that woodpeckers can eat. And so it's really important if to keep your forest as healthy as you can, so you have lots of woodpeckers that can keep maybe some of those harmful invasive species down as well. I'm used to interacting with a group, so I'm having a little trouble just keeping on one way, but I think that's the way I've got to get through this, and then we'll have questions at the end and I can interact with you. But I really enjoy interacting with whoever I'm talking with. So lots of other species are going to benefit besides birds. Our mammals, our timber rattlesnakes. People have either kind of a love-hate relationship with that, but I think it's a pretty cool species, and we finally protected it in Iowa about 15 years ago. Spring peepers, things like northern myotis, this is a candidate species for federal listing, so it'll probably be an endangered or threatened species soon. And southern flying squirrels, this species is actually doing pretty well yet. So summary, how could we improve habitat that you have in your backyard or on your farm or in your area? What are the limiting factors? I mentioned food, cover, water, space. Forest openings, how big they are, how small they are, availability of nest cavities. So plan cooperatively. One thing you can do is work with your neighbors and have a management plan or a plan of action that involves your neighbor. And you'll be able to do a heck of a lot more if you do it that way. And of course, seek advice. There are lots of foresters, extension people like Jay that can help you make the right decisions on how you manage your forest. We have private lands foresters. We have private lands biologists, wildlife biologists that actually know quite a bit about forestry. So managing forests for the future, stewardship involves managing forests so that populations of native wildlife species can be around for future generations. American Indians typically like to manage 7 generations ahead, thinking 7 generations ahead. That's something our society is not real good at, but if we did that, we would make really good decisions, I think. So create a long-term forest management plan. Strive for management options that provide the most benefits for the longest period of time, and manage your forest in habitat types, habitat features, wildlife species that are scarce. Try to make it better for those particular species that are dwindling in numbers. And so these are some of the different organizations, Wild Turkey Federation, Pheasants Forever, a number of different organizations in Iowa. Nature Conservancy is a real good one. And then of course NRCS, there are a number of federal farm programs that you can sign up with, and also some forest reserve program. Don't forget your university extension folks. How am I doing on time? I'm not paying any attention.
You're doing very well.
Okay, good. One of the things I'm involved with is in Iowa, we're creating bird conservation areas, and I don't think I have time to go into that very much, but we're creating brochures for each one of our bird conservation areas that includes all of the birds that occur in that forest, as well as which ones are declining or which ones are the greatest conservation need. And I only have 5 or 6 of those brochures here about Effigy Mounds Yellow River Forest, but I'm happy to give those to somebody if you want them. We also have technical guides that I didn't bring that are for bird management in forests and in prairies and in wetlands. Okay, so in kind of a summary, manage for declining priority bird species, and we can also keep our common species common. And larger blocks of habitat should provide for more species. And manage for birds, you'll also be benefiting all other kinds of wildlife as well, in general. And the partnership thing, that's something that as an agency person I've learned over time, because when I started my career, we tried to do everything kind of independently. We do almost everything in partnership with private landowners, NRCS, different conservation groups. Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation is a huge one in Iowa for land protection and working with landowners. And that's it. So I'm ready for questions if you've got them.
Which did you say will take care of the ash blower? You said there's something that
Yeah, woodpeckers in general, but I don't remember which particular species, but I think there's one particular species that may be better than others. But in general, the larger woodpeckers like red-bellied woodpecker and red-headed probably would be good.
Can you also repeat the question too for everyone?
Oh, yes, thanks.
Sure. Thanks.
Uh-huh.
You spoke of fragmentation. Can fragmentation problems be resolved by maintaining our fence rows with $6 corn? Almost all of our fence rows went bye-bye. And does a fence row constitute diminished fragmentation or not? Or how big of a deal is it?
Oh, I think we've lost 100,000 acres of forest in the last 5 years because of that, and taking it out for corn production. I'm not sure how we're going to deal with it. Corn's going to have to get cheaper, I think, before it changes. But yeah, as long as we keep knocking the forest back, we're going to lose species. We're going to lose lots of species in Iowa in particular. I don't see any other alternative unless we start, rebuilding those forests, making larger blocks and connecting them. Does that answer your question?
Well, is a fence row a connector?
Okay, now I got you.
Does it diminish fragmentation?
It's interesting. He asked, is a fence row a connector? So let's say a wooded fence row between 2 blocks of timber, is that a connector? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And what's interesting about that is we have kind of mixed messages depending on how we want to manage an area. Sometimes we take that out because that's a travel corridor for predators. But it's interesting you asked that question, because I was just thinking about that this morning when I woke up, when I was looking out the window over the landscape. I think it's real important to keep those, but you probably have to balance out the pros and cons of doing so. But especially for things like amphibians and reptiles and insects, those travel corridors are crucial. If they have to go across open space, they're not going to make it, usually. Yes. And I think what happens is, as we take these fence rows out, that allows us to just kind of make larger landscapes of corn and beans. That's my opinion anyway. So I think they do serve a purpose. Yes, Jay?
Along those lines, I think maybe we have to rethink the way we build fence rows, how we engineer fence rows, make them wider, make the
Yes.
species diversity.
Yes, that's a good point, Jay. I think that's exactly right. Wider swaths of habitat are going to be a lot better than a narrow little corridor.
Perhaps plant them intentionally with prairie grass as opposed to allowing ragweed to grow in there.
Well,
So much of our ditches and such are not managed as they could be. I drive down the
right.
road, they go in and they dig the ditch out to remove the dirt, and they let ragweed grow in when it could be decent habitat.
Yeah, I'm not going to try to address that as much. Actually, I like ragweed. Ragweed's really good for a lot of birds. It's a native species, but there are other things that are worse. But yeah, I understand what you're saying. He was wondering about the road ditches, if we can do better on the road ditches, improving that habitat. Certainly we can.
If you are putting in a fence row, seed it with something long-term like big blue.
Yes, actually, Iowa was kind of made first in the nation. We have a roadside program with County Conservation Board managers that actually manage roadsides. We've been doing that for quite a long time. And that started with a study by Pauline Drobny, who did her master's work in the early 80s from the University of Northern Iowa. And she was looking at the practices along roadsides and the fact that they're being sprayed, blanket sprayed every year, $40,000. And nothing's coming out of that except ragweeds and early successional species, and you lose all your prairie. And in the long term, it's cheaper to maintain the prairie, maintain your native species, than to try to fight that invasive species like Canada thistle and so forth.
Well, and when you go to like going to northern Wisconsin, you look at the road ditches up there, it's an attraction. It brings people in. They're beautiful ditches.
Yes.
Big, white, beautiful
Right.
ditches filled with wildflowers.
Right. But what I'm talking about today, I don't think road ditches is going to solve it, but it's a good step towards solving the fragmentation. Yes.
What is your feeling about fire in the woodlands?
Oh, thank you. I meant to have a slide on that. He asked about fire in the woodlands. I think fire in the woodlands is necessary. All of the, especially savanna open woodlands, and Pauline Drobny, the person I just mentioned earlier, says Iowa doesn't have forests, we have savannas. We have overgrown savannas. That's her input. But basically we had fire across the landscape. The American Indians burnt the landscape. But now we've got such small patches of timber, you have to be really careful how you burn them. So using backfire as much as you can. Burning in the fall is ideal when things aren't quite as abundant. You don't want to burn during nest season, obviously, but it's really good for sedges, for regrowth of forbs and so forth. So I think fire is a very important tool. I think we're still learning how to use that, but so I think we use it judiciously and carefully, but it's an important tool. Yes?
If you have an area that has the cavity nesters, but a lot of your cavities are kind of deteriorating,
Uh-huh.
and your newly girdled trees, like
Right,
you're
right.
aren't quite there yet, could you put in, like bird houses of some sort to give them some form of a cavity to help in that transitional period?
For those of you that didn't hear her question, she was wondering about like girdled trees and deteriorating cavities in those trees. Can you put nest boxes out? And yes, you can. Nest boxes are really high maintenance. I've done it. I ran a bluebird trail for 23 years with 60 to 70 bluebird boxes and helped the local population of bluebirds come back. So it can be done, but it takes a lot of time and effort. And if you're going to have nest boxes, you have to be responsible. You have to maintain them, keep the predators out of them. So that's the answer I'd give to that. But yeah, if you have a limited number of trees that you can retain for cavity nesters, you can add to that with nest boxes. Yes?
Got two questions, both
Uh-huh.
about birds. The first one is, since Christmas, we've had a group of about 5 or 6 bluebirds that are staying around our house. We have a heated bird
Oh,
pen.
yeah.
And I was just curious what they are eating, if it's just dried berries and whatnot. And then the other question is about cowbirds. are they protected, or can you do something to control them?
Oh. Okay, did all of you hear those questions? We'll start with the bluebirds. She was wondering what bluebirds are eating this time of the year. From what I've observed, they're eating the same thing as the robins, berries, old dried berries. If they're into the sumac by now, they're getting down to the last thing, but they do eat cedar berries as well. So that's primarily what they're eating, I think. And then as far as cowbirds, they are protected by federal and state law. You can't whack them. You have to have permits.
Can you
And
whack their eggs?
no, you can't mess with the nest, you can't mess with the eggs legally, no. So you want to try to manage to keep them out. And they deserve to be here. People get angry with great horn. I work with peregrine falcons. Peregrine falcons got killed by great horned owls. And I remember when Minnesota killed 50 great horned owls at a release site for peregrines in the Weaver Dunes in southeast Minnesota. And Carol Henderson said the great horned owls just kept showing up. So they eventually, that's when we started releasing peregrine falcons in town, because you can't kill enough great horned owls to be able to successfully release peregrines in great horned owl habitat. And now we have enough peregrines that they're dealing with the great horned owl. So there are ways to deal with things, but sometimes it's not killing off the other animals that are competing with them. Does that answer that okay? Okay.
Has anyone done any research to give us an idea of how many feral cats are actually are in Iowa?
No, I don't know anyone. He's asking about feral cats in Iowa. I don't know that anyone's done any research in Iowa. We have a lot. Mm-hmm.
Can you do an early spring woodland burn and not
Oh, yes.
affect your about how late can you go
Okay.
without affecting amphibians?
Yes. She asked how late you could go if you did a spring burn in the forest. And I just was reading about that, and I'm giving a talk about amphibians and reptiles. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't know. Some amphibians and reptiles are already out, at least in southern parts of Illinois. Safely, probably till late April. So at this latitude, probably late April, early May would be pretty safe. And actually, sometimes you're going to burn up some amphibians and reptiles. I know at least a couple stories of people burning up Massasauga rattlesnakes, which are very rare. But in the ultimate, that loss of one animal doesn't mean anything, because you saved the species from going extinct because you recreated the habitat it needs to keep moving forward. So you balance that out as well. But yeah, try to minimize the damage if you can. And again, slow-moving fires, backfires work really well. Most herps can get away from those. Snakes can certainly get away from them. Yes?
Sometimes the management practices have unintended consequences. Bought a farm 10 years ago that had a wet pasture in it that had been grazed for years,
Uh-huh.
and had a lot of sedges in the wetter areas,
Uh-huh.
and it had bobolinks in it.
Cool.
And then over time, we put in wetlands down in that area just by building berms and had shallow wetlands. And when the bobolinks have pretty much left, we still had a nesting pair, I think maybe left last year. But I'm trying to figure out why
Okay.
they would leave the area. And I think it must have something to do with I'm thinking red-winged blackbirds and some other species have come in since the wetlands were there.
Okay.
Another thought I've had, I've taken out the fence that ran around that pasture.
So
Perches.
I can speculate on that one. I actually have worked a lot with grassland birds. So bobolinks require, especially medium-length grassland. They love hayfields, of course. And is some of your planting taller? Is some of the stuff you put back really tall, like big blue stems, stuff like that?
Well, I've got about 80 acres of CP25, which is a reconstructed
Okay.
prairie,
Yeah.
that borders this area. Also, the dick thistles are less. I have less of those too.
Wh-
10 years ago when it was grazed.
Okay.
I didn't know what.
So his concern with, can all of you hear what he's talking about? Okay. Yeah, both of those species are declining, and I hear from people every year. I had bobolinks a couple years ago, not seeing them anymore. Bobolinks are area sensitive as well. They typically, so if they're showing up and nesting in an area that's, say, 10 or 15 acres, you'll see them a number of years and then they disappear. Well, that was probably a population sink. They come in here and they nest. They aren't successful. Eventually, they haven't reproduced enough offspring to come back and keep that population going. So that happens. That's one thing that happens. But the habitat changes over time. They have very specific requirements. For instance, I keep promoting medium height grassland plants. In Iowa, we went big blue stem. A lot of the tall grasses is what we've been promoting for years. Well, that only is used by a certain number of species. So if you do little blue stem plantings with grama grass or cytosgrama, you're going to have a different suite of birds that uses that, and it'll be more different species. Even grasshopper sparrows require really short grass. So just the size of your patch of habitat is probably important, as well as what that composition is. And then the other factor could just be that a local population is decreasing too. And that's related quite a bit to the wintering grounds.
You don't think the wetland is the problem then?
Yeah, it certainly wouldn't be the competition with red-winged blackbirds, I don't think. At least I've never heard of that. Yeah. Yes?
Reed canary grass, is it of much benefit for birds?
Reed canary grass is beneficial to things like sedge wrens and maybe Hensel sparrows, but mostly just sedge wrens. Not a lot, not like the native. And of course, reed canary grass, there is a native reed canary grass, but that's apparently, according to the botanist friends I have in Iowa, that it's hybridized out so much that it's hard to tell which is which at this point. But reed canary grass is a problem in the grasslands.
Invasive species?
Yes, it has become invasive. Yes?
There been a general decline in the number of whippoorwills?
Whippoorwills have crashed.
Because of the-
Yeah, she's asking about whippoorwills. I get lots of calls every year. Where are my whippoorwills? I blame a little bit on deer. High deer populations remove that understory, that photos I showed you.
Because they're ground nesters, maybe?
They are ground nesters. That's probably part of it. It could be on the wintering grounds. It's probably it's almost never one thing. It's almost always several things.
Is there any way to get them back?
Just the management practices. And actually, if you are using fire in your woodland, if you have an open woodland and use fire, and the patch size, they're also area sensitive, so they like areas with lots of forest. And I'm not sure what the percentage is, but they like a certain percentage of forest in 1 or 2 square miles. But their numbers have decreased very dramatically. That's a greatest conservation needs species for many states that wasn't on our radar screen even 10 years ago. But they've definitely declined. But if you have a healthy forest, do the management practices that have all those different layers. The other thing that I've noticed in southern Iowa, where we used to have lots of whippoorwills, I've worked on Breeding Bird Atlas in the 1980s. Iowa's Breeding Bird Atlas was a 5-year project. We repeated that, so we just finished that in 2012. So I went back to a lot of the same areas that I went to 20 years ago. And whippoorwills were very common in our state forests in southern Iowa 20 years ago. They aren't now. So I started looking at what's the difference. Well, the difference is there's no grassland right up to that forest. It's corn and beans right up to the forest. So there's no transition in a lot of the state areas right on the edge. So I think that's what made the difference. And within the forest, we're growing trees, we aren't growing grass. So I think that transition from grassland to forest is probably part of it too. Just change. Mm-hmm.
Do any of the evasives that are coming in have a benefit or detract from wildlife?
Autumn olive, as much as I don't like it because it just takes over everything, I think and I haven't looked at the food quality. I'm not sure about the food quality of the berries, but birds love it, and they nest in it successfully because it's pretty rank. But I still don't want to promote it. But that would be the one species that I could think off the top of my head that might not be as harmful as some of the others. For instance, honeysuckle, the berries, cardinals and other species that are eating honeysuckle berries, they can actually almost starve to death on that. The nutrition of those berries is much less than the native species. Mm-hmm.
What bird species are associated with like big thickets of prickly ash?
Prickly ash, not sure. Catbirds for sure.
I've seen a lot of woodcock around there.
Yeah, woodcock it'd probably be good spots for them to as shelter, but I'm not sure specifically any species that caters to it. But yeah, shrub species like maybe eastern towhee might use it some, but the towhee is going to be nesting on the ground. Catbirds are nesting right in it.
I don't see many nests or anything.
Okay,
of any kind.
and I've never seen a nest in it, and I've seen a lot of nests. So,
Yeah.
but certainly it would provide some structural benefit.
Are the berries of any food value?
I'm not sure. Have you ever eaten one? Make your tongue, yeah, make your tongue go numb. It is a citrus.
We call them toothache berries.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah. So they probably have some vitamin C in them or something. Any other questions? Yes.
Do we do
Change the weather, yeah. That's the biggest factor.
But what if, I mean, growing up, I had the weather too. I mean,
We didn't have weather like this.
but I mean, habitat,
Yeah, well, habitat will preserve them, certainly. And in fact, the good news, you know, having worked in the Breeding Bird Atlas, I worked in all 99 counties in the state, was in 656 of our 791 blocks. And I found pheasants pretty much every block where they should be, you know, where the habitat was. Because there's a big concern that they're gone. They're just gone from large areas of the state. And they aren't. They're still around, but they're in those, where the good habitat exists. They're still there, but they're just there in very low numbers.
I planted about 7 acres of conifers 22 years ago, and that seems to be a really good place for pheasants in hard weather like this year.
Yeah, but once we get to the weather that we've had in the last couple of weeks, especially with lots of deep snow and really cold, you need those wind breaks. That's sure.
I actually go in and cut down the Scotch pine, provide brush piles for them to stay on.
Mhm.
It seems to help.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yes.
Do you think that the increase in the hawks and the eagles that we have are having an impact on the pheasant
No,
population?
I don't. There have been enough studies done on red-tailed hawks. Red-tailed hawks are killing pheasants, there's no doubt about that. When that pheasant's trying to go from that windbreak half a mile or a mile away to find something to eat, the red-tails are taking them. But that's not the reason that pheasants are disappearing, but they do take some. Yeah, cats are going to take a lot more of the young ones, but and as far as eagles, they aren't any threat to pheasants. But yeah, we like to blame other things. We like to blame the predators for sure, but it's really, for pheasants, it's really all about the weather. Whenever we get more than 30 inches of snow a year in the winter, we don't have good pheasant production. And we're up at least in my house, we're up to 45 inches right now. We had 29 inches in February. And at the tail end of winter, that's really hard on all of the ground birds. I'm not sure how grouse are handling it, but yes.
I've seen a lot of success where they're planting switchgrass. That tends to provide cover for pheasants.
Yes, I think switchgrass does. And pheasant, I'm not sure it's great nesting habitat, but it's certainly wonderful. Anything that's tall and rank, the cattails are almost gone. I mean, they're covered with snow for the most part in a lot of places now too, but cattails are one of the better areas. The cattail marshes are really good pheasant refugia this time of the year.
Switchgrass actually provides quite a bit of food for them too.
I'm not sure how much they eat the seed, but yeah, the large seed that switchgrass produces could be useful. But a better one is ragweed. Yes.
I was thinking long term here for cavity trees. Is there a better tree to provide cavity, basswood, silver maple, something?
Oh, yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I'm not sure I've ever really thought about that. The oaks are going to stand longer, so if you want to think in terms of how long they're going to last, I would think something that's going to be freestanding for a long time, like a cottonwood, would just be there a few years and gone, but oaks probably will stand longer, so maybe, yeah, I'm not sure. Yes?
along with the pheasant decline, are quail numbers in Iowa declining?
Yes. So I talked about the Breeding Bird Atlas in the 80s versus the Breeding Bird Atlas just recently. Our quail population went from extreme northern Iowa to basically the bottom 3 or 4 tiers of counties. We still have a few further up, but not many. So yeah, they've really, and that's mostly land use changes. That connectivity issue is crucial for quail. They have to be able to go from patch to patch and so forth. And once you eliminate those fence rows, eliminate those travel corridors, they kind of get in trouble.
Same thing for partridge.
And then the weather. And the weather's really been hard on, quail just can't take winters like this very well. Mm-hmm.
Where are your biggest areas, blocks of forest in Iowa?
The very biggest is northeast. So Yellow River Forest, that complex is the very best. That's why there's 191 territories of ceruleans that have been identified. Shimmick Forest down in the southeast corner of Lee County is another nice, really large block. We have a bird conservation area in that area. And then our Stevens Forest areas in Lucas and Clark County and southern tier, so it's like the second tier up. There's quite a few forests there. So basically it's eastern Iowa and eastern maybe half of Iowa in the southern part. It's where our best forests are. And then Les Hills used to be prairie in Savannah. That's becoming a forest. We actually have a forest in the Les Hills now. Yes?
Could you
Yeah, I'm not sure I can go into any detail. I do know that there's a roadside management program that's instituted out of the University of Northern Iowa, and that's really kind of what started the whole program for the county conservation board. So the county conservation boards, not all of them have biologists that are roadside biologists, but quite a few of them do.
Who's the mover and shaker? Is it county government, or is it the state government, or the university?
Most of the work's done by the county government, county agencies, and then of course the University of Northern Iowa. I think that.
There's a cost to that, I would imagine, if a farmer's gonna take land out of production for roadside management.
No, this is just on the roadsides. It's not.
I know, my wife and I drove from Illinois down to the National Tallgrass Prairie in Kansas.
Okay.
It seems like western Iowa, then we cut across the northwest corner of Missouri, then down into Kansas, down around Lawrence, and it's just wonderful. I mean, they extend their prairie,
Oh.
prairie off to the side of the road, maybe 50 yards, 40 yards.
Well, actually, in southern Iowa, those prairies will extend out. I've watched it happen over time, especially if you have a conservation reserve program, grassland planted right next to a roadside that's still got a lot of native vegetation. That stuff will end up out in the middle of that. It takes 10 or 15 years, but it'll get there by itself.
Who's the size of the ditch? How far from the center of the road out?
I don't know. I can't answer that. I don't know.
County or state?
It probably depends if it's a state highway or a county highway or county road, what jurisdiction. How are we doing on time? 2 more minutes. Yes.
The state of Illinois has got some new legislature trying to go through that is justifying opening a bobcat hunting season because of the decline in quail. In your experience?
Really?
Yes, really. That's one of the justifications is that
Huh.
we need to boost the quail numbers. So as a biologist,
Well, maybe they have research that indicates that. We did not find that in our research in Iowa.
Thank you.
We saw no correlation.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, and not that they won't take quail. They're absolutely going to catch quail, but I can't imagine, just like the hawks, I can't imagine that's the major limiting factor. And I'm not really against, so she mentioned bobcat, so that's going to send me off. Bobcat was a endangered or threatened species in the state of Iowa not that long ago, and fortunately we had bobcats come in, and it came in very much with the Conservation Reserve Program in southern Iowa. We had populations come in from Kansas and Nebraska and Missouri, and eventually we had a self-sustaining population of bobcats. When I started, we had 4 bobcats that were trapped in Oklahoma that were supposed to be released in Iowa. The Cattlemen's Association stopped that from happening. When we closed the wildlife exhibit, those bobcats accidentally got loose. That was my input, and I don't know who did it. I didn't know who did that for 20 years. I didn't know who did it for 20 years.
Do you have a trapping season now? Is there a trapping or a hunting season on them now?
Yes, there is, and it's very sustainable. I had reservations about it, but it looks like it's a sustainable practice, and bobcats are still moving north. Yeah, they are moving north. Mm-hmm. One more.
In Illinois, when you harvest a deer, you go to the check station. When the counties have check stations, one of the questions they ask you, have you seen any bobcats?
Yeah, good. Yeah, I think they turned out to be a little bit more adaptable than we thought, but they need the habitat. Okay, well, thank you very much.